The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a long highway when most of the city is already asleep. The only sounds were the occasional hum of tires on asphalt and the distant chirping of crickets. Victoria Kane, a seasoned military prosecutor, gripped the steering wheel lightly, her mind still replaying the events of the day. It had been a victory, a major case won against a high-ranking officer involved in corruption, a verdict that would send ripples through the military ranks. Yet despite her success, she felt no triumph. She was used to these battles, to the politics, to the way men in power squirmed when their unchecked authority was finally challenged. She sighed, adjusting her rearview mirror. That's when she saw them, red and blue lights flashing behind her. Her brows furrowed. She wasn't speeding, hadn't broken any laws. Still, she signaled, changed lanes, and slowly pulled over onto the side of the deserted road. A patrol car rolled to a stop behind her, and a figure emerged. He moved with an air of unearned arrogance, each step slow and deliberate, as if he enjoyed the power his uniform gave him. The glare of his flashlight swept over her car before landing on her through the driver's window. Officer Nathan Steele. The name meant nothing to Victoria in that moment, but the way he carried himself, like a man who was used to obedience, used to intimidation working in his favor, that told her everything she needed to know. Without greeting, without explanation, his voice cut through the night. License and registration. Victoria kept her face neutral as she reached into her glove compartment, moving with careful, deliberate slowness. She had seen these encounters go wrong. She wasn't about to give him an excuse. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" Her tone was polite, even. Steele took the documents from her outstretched hand, but didn't bother to look at them right away. Instead, he tilted his head, smirking slightly as his gaze flicked over her. Victoria Kane. He read her name out loud, rolling it over his tongue as if testing the weight of it. Military prosecutor? That's interesting. Victoria said nothing. Steele took a step back, finally glancing at her registration before snapping it shut. "Your vehicle matches the description of a car involved in a crime earlier tonight," he said smoothly, slipping the documents into his pocket instead of handing them back. "I need you to step out so I can conduct a search." Victoria didn't react immediately. She knew the law. She knew her rights. More importantly, she knew the game men like Steele played. He had nothing on her, no probable cause, no legitimate reason for this stop. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about power. "That doesn't sound right," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I haven't left the courthouse since this afternoon. I'd like to know more about this alleged crime." Steele's smirk widened slightly. He was expecting resistance. He liked it. "Ma'am," he said, his tone mockingly polite now, "I wasn't asking." Victoria's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He was escalating. This wasn't the first time she had seen it happen. How power could turn a simple traffic stop into a confrontation, into an abuse of authority. She forced herself to exhale slowly. Stay in control. "I'm not refusing to cooperate, officer," she said carefully. "I just need to understand what I'm being accused of before I—" Click. Steele pressed the button on his radio, speaking in a bored, almost lazy tone. "Dispatch, I've got a non-compliant driver here, requesting backup." Victoria's pulse quickened, but her expression didn't change. He was baiting her. The smart move, the safe move, was to de-escalate. She knew that, but she also knew giving in meant letting him win, letting men like him keep winning. A beat passed, and then Steele moved. Fast, he yanked open her door before she could react, grabbing her wrist in a bruising grip. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Victoria held her ground, keeping her voice level. "I will comply, but I need you to state a lawful reason for detaining me." Steele's smirk disappeared. For the first time since he had walked up to her car, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance. Then, without another word, he spun her around and snapped cold steel cuffs around her wrists. Too tight. On purpose. Victoria gritted her teeth as Steele shoved her forward, forcing her toward his patrol car. The night air was sharp, cool against her face, but inside, a slow fire was burning. Steele thought this was just another traffic stop. Just another woman he could intimidate. Just another person of color who wouldn't dare challenge him. He had no idea who he had just put in handcuffs. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Victoria Kane's wrists, sending a sharp pulse of pain up her arms. Steele had tightened them on purpose. She had faced adversaries in the courtroom, ruthless military officers, corrupt commanders, criminals who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. Steele wasn't following the law. He was using his badge as a weapon. Victoria kept her face composed as Steele shoved her into the back seat of his patrol car. The plastic seat was hard, the space cramped, but she made no move to adjust herself. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Steele slid into the driver's seat, checking his mirror with that same smug smirk plastered across his face. The kind of look that said he had done this before and gotten away with it. As the car pulled onto the darkened highway, Steele let out a low chuckle. "You really think you're somebody, don't you?" His voice was laced with amusement, but there was something darker beneath it, something that hinted at the pleasure he took in moments like these. Victoria exhaled slowly, controlling her breathing, controlling her reaction. "I know exactly who I am," she said, her voice even. "The question is, do you?" Steele's grip on the wheel tightened for just a second. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with another smirk. Big talk for someone in cuffs. Victoria met his gaze in the mirror, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to talk. He had no idea what storm he had just set in motion. Inside the station, the silent complicity of corruption. When they reached the precinct, Steele yanked the door open and dragged her out without ceremony, his fingers biting into her upper arm. The station was dimly lit, mostly quiet. Late-night processing was slow, and Steele clearly had no intention of following protocol. No mugshot, no phone call, no Miranda rights. Victoria's lawyer instincts kicked in instantly. Illegal detention, procedural misconduct, abuse of power. And yet, none of the officers around them reacted. She scanned the room as Steele led her through the precinct. Several uniformed officers stood by, some typing at their desks, others sipping coffee, but none of them looked in her direction. They knew. They all knew what Steele was doing, and they weren't going to stop him. Victoria's jaw tightened. She had seen this before, in corrupt military tribunals, in courtrooms where power was protected above justice. Steele shoved her forward, pushing her into a holding cell with enough force that she had to catch herself on the cold steel bench. The door slammed behind her with a heavy metallic clang. The air inside was thick, a mixture of stale sweat, old disinfectant, and the lingering stench of injustice. Victoria straightened, rolling her shoulders slightly as the sharp pain of the cuffs lingered on her wrists. She turned to face the bars just as Steele leaned in, too close. His breath carried the faint scent of coffee and arrogance. "You must think you're special," he murmured, his tone dropping lower, more condescending. "A military prosecutor, huh? Guess what? That doesn't mean a damn thing in here." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him the way she studied men on the witness stand, watching for cracks, for weaknesses. Steele had power, but men like him always made one mistake. They thought power was the same thing as control. He smirked again, tapping at his fingers lightly against the steel bars. "Let me explain how this works," he continued, voice slow, mocking. "Nobody's coming for you. Not tonight, not tomorrow. You can scream all you want, but when the sun comes up, you'll still be just another criminal in the system." Victoria let out a soft, amused breath. Steele frowned slightly at her reaction. He was expecting fear, anger, resistance. Instead, she smiled. Not a smirk, not a forced expression, a slow, knowing smile. The kind of smile that made men like Steele uneasy without knowing why. "You think so?" she asked softly, her voice a whisper against the quiet hum of the station. Steele's smirk faltered for just a second. Victoria leaned forward, just enough that the dim light reflected off her sharp, unwavering eyes. "Let's see who really has the power when the sun comes up." Victoria Kane sat in the dimly lit holding cell, her back straight, her posture relaxed. She wasn't worried. Unlike Steele, she knew real power wasn't about control. It was about influence. And she had plenty of that. The cold steel bench beneath her didn't faze her. The flickering overhead light, the faint murmur of officers in the hallway, none of it unsettled her. Because this wasn't her first battle. She had faced men far more dangerous than Steele, and she had won every time. The call that changed everything. Somewhere in the precinct, a phone rang. The kind of phone call that made men in power sit up straight. Victoria's allies were moving. The officer at the front desk hesitated before answering. He spoke in hushed tones, his eyes darting toward the holding cells. His posture shifted. Tension crept into his shoulders. Steele, who had been standing near the lockers, arms crossed, noticed. His smug confidence wavered for a split second. Something was happening. Victoria caught the change immediately. From behind the bars, she tilted her head slightly, watching as Steele's fingers flexed against his belt. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. A moment later, a second officer burst the precinct, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp. "Sergeant Steele," he called out, his tone clipped. Steele turned, his jaw tightening. "What?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the cell where Victoria sat. "She's being released." Silence. Steele's expression darkened. He took a slow step forward, his body stiff with barely restrained anger. "On whose orders?" The officer handed him the clipboard. "Straight from the military's legal division." Victoria watched as Steele scanned the paper, his grip tightening on the document. His face paled slightly. He knew exactly what this meant. She smiled. Checkmate. The courtroom showdown. 2 days later, Victoria walked into the courthouse not as a defendant, but as a force of reckoning. Dressed in a navy blue blazer, her posture exuded confidence. Not arrogance, just the certainty of a woman who knew she was about to dismantle the man who thought he could break her. Steele was already there, seated beside his lawyer, his usual smirk absent. He looked smaller today. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and officials, but with officers. Some who had known Steele for years, some who had suspected his corruption but never dared to say it. They were all waiting to see how far this would go. Judge Holloway, a seasoned man with sharp eyes and an even sharper reputation for intolerance toward misconduct, entered and took his seat. He wasted no time. "Let's begin." The prosecutor stood, his presence commanding. "Your Honor, this case is about more than just an unlawful arrest." He turned toward Steele. "This is about a pattern of abuse, one that has gone unchecked for far too long." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria didn't need to say a word. She had already won. The evidence that buried him. The prosecutor continued. "We will present body cam footage, arrest records, and witness testimony proving that Sergeant Steele has not only abused his authority, but has specifically targeted individuals of color under the guise of law enforcement." Steele shifted in his seat. His lawyer tried to interject. "Your Honor, my client—" Judge Holloway held up a hand. "Play the footage." A screen descended from the wall, and then the world saw Steele for who he really was. The video showed everything. His aggressive tone, his escalation of a simple traffic stop, his mocking words, the way he yanked Victoria from her car without cause, the way he smiled when he tightened the cuffs. It was damning. When the footage ended, the room was silent. The judge steepled his fingers. "Sergeant Steele," he said, his voice calm but razor sharp, "would you like to explain why the person in that footage bears an uncanny resemblance to you?" Steele clenched his jaw. His lawyer scrambled. "Your Honor, my client was following standard protocol." "Really?" The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Because according to department policy, protocol involves informing a suspect of their rights, which he did not. It involves a justified reason for detainment, which he did not have. It involves treating all citizens equally under the law, which he has clearly failed to do." The judge leaned forward. "Sergeant Steele, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Steele's throat bobbed. He opened his mouth, closed it. Victoria folded her hands on the table, watching them. This was the moment he realized it was over. The verdict. The fall of a corrupt officer. Judge Holloway sighed, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. "The charges against Victoria Kane are dismissed." A slow ripple of movement passed through the room. Victoria didn't move. She had expected this. But then Judge Holloway turned his gaze towards Steele. "As for you, Sergeant Steele, this court recommends immediate suspension pending further investigation into your record. Furthermore, the evidence provided today will be forwarded to Internal Affairs for formal review." A collective gasp. Victoria's lips curled into a slow, victorious smile. Steele had lost everything. The aftermath. When power is held accountable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Victoria ignored them all. She had made her statement in court. As she walked toward her car, her phone buzzed. A message from a high-ranking military official. Justice served. Let's talk soon. She exhaled, looking up at the skyline. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person Steele had hurt. And now he would never hurt anyone again. 2 weeks had passed since the night Sergeant Nathan Steele had abused his power, dragging Victoria Kane into a wrongful arrest. But today, the roles had reversed. This time, Steele wasn't in control. He wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one standing trial. The walk of shame, Steele walked into the courthouse, his usual arrogance replaced with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The press had gathered outside, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions. Sergeant Steele, do you have anything to say about the allegations? Are you worried about the charges against you? Do you regret what happened that night? Steele didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his steps stiff. This wasn't the first time he had walked into a courtroom, but it was the first time he was the one being judged. As he entered, his eyes scanned the room, and then he saw her. Victoria Kane stood tall, her posture unshaken, unbothered, unbreakable. She wasn't in an orange jumpsuit. She wasn't in cuffs. She was in control. And worse for him, she was the lead prosecutor in his case. The evidence that broke him. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal officials, but with officers. Some were there to support Steele. Others, to watch him burn. Judge Holloway entered, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file in front of him. Let's begin. Victoria stepped forward, her voice steady and precise. Your Honor, the prosecution is ready to present evidence proving that Sergeant Nathan Steele not only conducted an unlawful arrest, but has a repeated history of racial profiling, abuse of power, and falsifying reports. A murmur ran through the room. Victoria continued, We will demonstrate that the night of my arrest was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a long-standing pattern of misconduct, one that has gone unchecked for far too long. She turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. And today that ends. She gestured toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. Play the footage, the video that ended his career. The room went silent as the body cam footage played. It showed everything. Steele's smug expression, his aggressive tone, the way he ripped Victoria from her car without justification, the way he tightened the cuffs just to hurt her. But it didn't stop there. The footage cut to the police station's surveillance cameras. It showed how Steele skipped procedure, how he ignored protocol, how he mocked Victoria, taunted her, treated her like she was beneath him. It was damning, and then came the final blow. The prosecutor pulled up Steele's arrest records from the past 5 years. The numbers were undeniable. Over 75% of his traffic stops involved Black or Hispanic drivers. More than a dozen complaints had been filed against him. Several officers had submitted reports about his excessive force, but nothing had been done. Until now. Victoria turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this is not just an issue of one bad cop making a mistake. This is an issue of unchecked power being used to target and oppress. If we let him walk away from this, then we are telling every officer in this country that they are above the law. She let that sink in before delivering the final blow. But Sergeant Steele is not above the law. Not today, not ever. Steele's fall. Judge Holloway removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. He exhaled slowly. Then he looked up at Steele. Sergeant Steele, do you have anything to say for yourself? Steele's law archer whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. His confidence, his invincibility was gone. The weight of the evidence crushed him. Finally, the judge spoke. Effective immediately, Sergeant Nathan Steele is stripped of his badge and dismissed from duty. Steele stiffened. Furthermore, due to the overwhelming evidence of racial profiling and abuse of authority, this court recommends a full criminal investigation into his prior misconduct. A collective gasp. Steele's face went pale. Pending further review, the judge added, the district attorney will determine whether charges should be filed. Silence. And then, the gavel slammed down. It was over. The aftermath. When power is held accountable. Victoria didn't look at Steele as he was escorted out of the courtroom. She didn't need to. She had already won. As she stepped outside, the press swarmed her. Microphones, flashing cameras, reporters shouting. Victoria, how does it feel to win this case? Do you think justice was served today? What's next for you? She paused, looking directly into the nearest camera. This wasn't about winning. She exhaled. This was about accountability. She glanced toward the courthouse doors, where Steele was being led out in handcuffs. And today, accountability won. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Her job was done. But the fight for justice, that was just getting started. Victoria Kane didn't celebrate. She didn't toast to her victory. She didn't let herself bask in the headlines that painted her as a hero. Because she knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. A story that refused to die. The moment the courtroom doors closed behind her, the media storm erupted. Victoria's case wasn't just a local scandal. It became a national conversation. News outlets dissected every second of Steele's downfall. The footage of his abuse, the evidence of his racial profiling, the undeniable corruption in his precinct. It was everywhere. Social media exploded. Hashtags flooded the internet. Hashtag justice for Victoria, hold them accountable, end police abuse. Even those who had once ignored these issues couldn't look away anymore. And that was exactly what Victoria wanted. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted justice for every person who had suffered under men like Steele. And she was about to make sure they got it. The second fall of Nathan Steele. 1 week later, Victoria sat in her office reviewing case files when her phone buzzed. A familiar voice greeted her. You're going to want to turn on the news. Victoria grabbed the remote and flipped the channel. There he was, Nathan Steele. Again, but this time he wasn't walking into a courthouse as a disgraced officer. He was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. Arrested. Again. The anchor's voice rang through the speakers. Former Sergeant Nathan Steele has been taken into custody following newly surfaced evidence linking him to multiple incidents of excessive force and falsified police reports. Victoria exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She knew this would happen. Once the cracks in Steele's armor had formed, the dam broke. Whistleblowers came forward. Officers who had witnessed his misconduct but had been too afraid to speak. Victims who had been too scared to report what he had done to them. But now Steele was powerless. And when a man like him lost power, the truth poured out like floodwaters. This wasn't just a misconduct case anymore. This was a full-blown federal investigation. And Steele wasn't just going to lose his badge this time. He was going to lose everything, a seat at the table. A few days after Steele's second arrest, Victoria received an invitation, not to a TV interview, not to a press conference, but to Washington, D.C. The Department of Justice wanted to meet with her. At first, she hesitated. She had spent years fighting her battles in courtrooms. Did she really want to fight them in politics too? But then she thought about everyone else who didn't have the resources, the voice, or the power to fight back. And suddenly there was only one answer. When reform becomes real, Victoria stepped into the halls of the Department of Justice, the weight of history pressing against her shoulders. She was led into a conference room filled with lawmakers, attorneys, and civil rights leaders, men and women who had spent decades fighting for justice, but had never had a case as high profile as hers to push for real change. She took her seat at the table. One of the officials leaned forward. Miss Kane, we've been following your case closely. The exposure you've brought to the issue of police misconduct has forced some uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Now we need to turn those conversations into action. Victoria nodded. What do you need from me? The man smiled. Your expertise, your voice, your leadership. Victoria exhaled, looking around the room. For years, these conversations had happened behind closed doors. For years, people had tried to fix the system from the inside. But now she was going to force real change. The final blow to Steele's legacy. A month later, Victoria was walking out of a meeting when her phone buzzed. A news alert. Breaking. Former Sergeant Nathan Steele found guilty of multiple counts of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and falsifying police reports. Sentencing hearing scheduled. Victoria didn't stop walking. She didn't need to. Steele was finished. His name, his career, His legacy? Destroyed, because he had picked the wrong person to mess with. And now he would spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when corruption goes unchecked. The fight never ends. As Victoria stepped onto the busy DC streets, she let the crisp air fill her lungs. This fight was never just about her. It was about holding power accountable. It was about changing a system that had protected men like Steele for too long. And she wasn't done yet, not even close. A reporter jogged up to her. "Miss Kane, now that Steele is behind bars, do you think justice has been served?" Victoria stopped. She met the reporter's gaze, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, just slightly. "Justice?" She shook her head. "Justice isn't one man losing his badge. Justice is making sure there are no more Nathan Steeles in the first place." Then without another word, she walked away toward her next battle, because this war was far from over. Victoria Kane's story isn't just about one corrupt officer. It's about a system that thrives when people remain silent. We see this every day, not just in law enforcement, but in workplaces, schools, and even personal relationships.